So what she told me, what this producer told me, was that whenever anything came on about the fighting in Iraq, viewership plummeted. Like, yeah, the ratings would just go down. And I was surprised, but you know, I don't want to, I mean, my words, America, it kind of moved on. But I think at that point, 6, 7 years of fighting, people were losing interest.
Hello, this is Tab Bartley, and you are listening to the Oath We Took podcast, the show that tells the Marine Corps story through the Marines that served. I'm joined today by Michael Armistead. He is the reason for this podcast. I know so many amazing Marines who hesitate to tell their stories. Their stories hold so much power and so many life lessons. Oftentimes, though, they go untold. Not every Marine story is the same. What is the same is the oath we all took. I am honored to have Michael on to share a piece of his story. Michael was a substitute teacher, journalist, field artillery crewman in the Army, and a gymnastics coach, all before becoming a Marine Corps officer. In today's episode, Michael shares his experience while serving over 22 years in the Marine Corps as a public affairs officer. He deployed multiple times and saw his career field completely change while in. He now continues to serve Marines through the Marine Corps Association. This week, I'm honored to have Michael on the podcast to share a piece of his story. Thank you, Michael, so much for joining me.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here to talk.
Of course. And the first question I always ask is, why did you decide to join the Marine Corps?
So that's actually a long story. I didn't actually join the Marine Corps first. I was in a couple of other services prior to joining the Marine Corps. But it all really started with my father many, many years ago. If you remember those Time Life books on World War II, and he was an avid reader. And so he had those books around the house. He also owned books like With the Old Breed and Goodbye Darkness. And so and I was young, 10, 11 years old. And so I would read some of those books, or at least thumb through them. And it really, it it told a lot of stories about the Marines and what they went through during World War II. And I wondered, like what would I do in those situations? Is this something that I could, you know, survive? And so at around, 12, 13, I asked my dad, it's like, what would you do if I joined the Marine Corps? And he said, I'd kick your butt and tell you to go to college. So I'm like, okay. But despite that, this was, in the early to mid 80s. There were magazines back in the day that used to have this little pull-out card, for more information, fill this card out and send it to, the recruiting station and you'd get something back. So pulled one of those out, filled it out, sent it in, and they actually responded. And the letter basically said, hey, thank you for your interest in the Marine Corps. But being that you're 13, we'd like you to
Get a little older.
finish high school and then come back and maybe we can talk. Well, that kind of killed the idea of joining the Marine Corps. And so my plan then was going off to college, and then I thought about being a doctor. And the best way to be a doctor, I thought, was to have it paid for through some type of scholarship. So I thought maybe if I got an ROTC scholarship in the Air Force.
Oh. Oh.
Yeah. So believe it or not, I was an Air Force ROTC for about a semester and absolutely hated it. Hated it. And so by the end of the first semester, I told the ROTC colonel that I wasn't really interested. But that bug, that seed was still planted. And so went through, 2, 3 years of college. And then believe it or not, I was playing paintball with some friends one weekend. And I'm like, I could really get into, playing with guns, running through the woods on the weekends. So, so I looked into the Army Reserves. At the time, I didn't really know much about, I didn't actually think the Marine Corps had a reserve unit, but looked into the Army Reserves. The summer after my junior year in college. So took the ASVAB, did pretty well. I don't know what the score was, but the recruiter was like, "Hey, um, you did really well. You could get into communications." I mean, they listed all of these jobs that you could do, and I'm like, "I want to do combat arms." And they're like, "Well, you don't need to. You did really well." And I'm like, "I just want to run through the woods on the weekend and shoot guns." And so they're like, "Okay." And the way the reserves are set up, your unit's based on your locale. So I lived in Durham, North Carolina, and there was a Black Hawk squadron, a medical unit, and a field artillery unit. And so I'm like, field artillery, that's big guns, right? It's like, yes. So I was signed up as a 13 Bravo and went to Fort Sill and became an artillery guy. Came back, and that was around 1990, right before, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, which freaked all of us out because, especially me, I'm like, hey, I still have one more year of college. Um, Fortunately, I didn't have to go, but did the Army Reserves for about 8 years. Yeah, crazy, right?
I had no idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
So as a 13 Bravo guy, loading shells and 8-inch howitzers and going to Fort Bragg and now Fort Liberty, I guess, and did that amongst, a number of different jobs that I had during that time. So, I had wanted to go to grad school, um, but didn't. And so right after graduating, I just had a number of different odd jobs tab. I was because I really didn't know what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
I looked at education, so I became a substitute teacher for a little bit. Yes, I was also considering journalism, and so I've worked at a few small newspapers and did freelancing. Um, and because none of those really made money, I I I I had a girlfriend at the time who was a gymnast, and in the process of watching her work out, I ended up getting a job at the gym as a gymnastics instructor, even though I'd never done
Done
gymnastics
gymnastics?
in my life. Um, and then because really that didn't make much money as well, I got a job as a operating room, storeroom stock boy for the most part in the OR, which actually paid pretty well. So if you can imagine, like I used to call these pie chart jobs. If you add them all up, it add up as a job. But it was it was not very satisfying, as you could imagine. And so I did all of these jobs for a number of years, waiting tables on the side, and just not real happy with where my life was at the point. So I ended up reaching out to my father, and I was like, Dad, I really don't know, what to do. I mean, I was considering going to law school because that was something I hadn't tried. And he said, well, could you consider being an officer in the Marine Corps? And I was like, what? I mean, it never even occurred to me. Um, and I was, 26, 27. So I knew there was like an age waiver. I was at least getting close to that.
Yeah.
So like, well, I'll check it out. And so I didn't know anything about OSOs, officer selection offices. So I went to a recruiter, and he's like, hey, the best officers are the ones that go enlisted. And I was like, hey man, I've already done that, with the Army. I'm not going to do that again. I'm much older. And he's like, okay. And he sent me over to the OSO. And at that point, really their concern was, are you physically capable of getting through OCS? So I was a runner in high school and somewhat in college. And so I still did that, doing 5Ks and 10Ks. So I was still pretty good at athletically. So that was fine. The one thing, believe it or not, that held me back was my eyesight. So I went through the whole process, and they came back, and I didn't get in because of my eyesight. And I'm like, seriously? And so I went and got a second opinion, and the second opinion said your eyes are good. Took that back, and they were like, hey, our Navy doc said your eyesight is no good, and sorry. So as you can imagine, Tab, that took some time to go through,
Yeah.
and so
And I was about to ask that. I mean, that is not a like anything with MEPS
no,
recruiting is really not a fast process.
right. So at that point, I was like, screw you guys,
Fair.
yeah, I'm going to go to law school. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And so, I left. So at that point in time, I was exclusively, teaching gymnastics, which that's a whole nother story in and of itself. Why I was actually a director of a program at that point, just because of people getting fired and what have you. So I'm back at the gym, teaching all my classes, and the OSO shows up. Now, mind you, I had never told anyone there that I was actually looking to, you know, join the Marine Corps. So he shows up in
Dress
his dress
blues.
blue mods. Yep. And comes down, and I'm in the middle of class, and he just waits in my office until I'm done. And if you're familiar with gymnastics gyms, there's the big viewing area so that everybody can watch what's going on. And so he just sits there and waits for me to finish. And so I walk into my office and I'm like, sir, is Captain Mark Tingle. It's like, sir, what are you doing here? And he's like, hey, you were really interested in being a Marine, because he's like, I found a way to get you in. I can get a waiver to you to, apply again. I'm like, you know what? I'll do it again. You'll find something else. You're like, I'm not doing it, sir. I'm not doing it. And he's like, well, what's your plan? I said, well, I just got promoted here, at the gym, you know, and he looks out, and I look out, and you see this kid's like jumping all over the equipment. It's just mayhem outside. And he's like, hey, you're telling me that you would rather do this than be a Marine. And I just started laughing. I'm like, okay, you got me. You're right. So submitted another package, and got approved, and went to OCS. This was 97, 98 time frame. So it took me a while. Um, but that's kind of how my whole career started.
And how was it being, older than your peers going through? How much of an impact did that have at like OCS and TBS?
So believe it or not, a lot of the officers were prior enlisted. So a lot of us were kind of the same age. Now, despite the
Okay.
fact that now I was in the Army, and had some time, a lot of my peers were, similar in age and experience. So it wasn't as you know, it wasn't a huge difference than you would think. I will say though, um, it was a little bit of a struggle, because of course you kind of fall back, at least at OCS, to kind of what you were accustomed to in similar situations. So, for example, when an officer enters a room, you might automatically say attention on deck, right? In the Army, it would be room 10 hut, right? And so the first week or so, you know, getting there, the there was one point when, an officer came into the squad bay, and I yelled, room 10 hut. And of course, no one did anything, because
What does that mean?
and so they're like, dude, what are you doing? I was like, that's what we say in the Army. It's like, you're not in the Army. This is the Marine Corps. So, there was some adjustment there. But you quickly figure that out. I will mention this though, which I thought was, pretty surprising. There was about 8 of us that came to OCS from the Raleigh area. and almost all of them either, dropped on request or got kicked out, which was surprising to me. Um, at one point, my OSO called. It's like, hey, you need to stick with it. I'm like, I'm doing well. And he's like, you're the only one left from that crew that went up there. And I'm like, seriously? And I didn't realize it probably reflected on him that all of the, the kids that he sent up, if they all dropped or got out,
Hmm.
it didn't really look good. So, a little bit more incentive to stick with it. But yeah, the age didn't really make a huge difference, but some of the experiences from the army impacted, you know, my experiences there at OCS.
And did you go in, like when you were deciding to be an officer, your
Mhm.
thought then was to go in full time, correct, in the Marine Corps, unlike when you were looking at the Army, or were you kind of undecided
I was
or
undecided,
okay.
because I mean, granted, I was, much older, and I knew kind of in the back of my mind that, if I started here, that was kind of a career move because it would be hard to start something else, in
Yeah.
your mid 30s. But I was going to give it 4 years, and see if I liked it or not. And you know how it is with the Marine Corps, even if you're kind of undecided, they dangle the carrot in front of you, and you
I
kind
do.
of um, keep you there. So I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do in the Marine Corps in terms of an MOS. I mean, I knew, public affairs was an option, um, but they don't really give you a lot of information on what those MOSs entail. So I thought public affairs was more like what our comic correspondents do, right?
Yeah.
That we'd be the ones writing the stories because that's kind of what I did. We'd be the ones, getting the imagery. They're like, no, that's your Marines do that.
That's on the list.
So like, what do we
Which
do?
which I feel like that's a trend, because I was on the recruiting side of the house too, but I
Mhm.
feel like officers don't get the like I had a better understanding, I think, enlisted of like what my job would entail than I
Right,
ever heard an explanation to an officer of like what their job would entail unless they were a pilot. Everybody else, like, and again, like I don't feel like they really had an understanding unless they were a Mustang that
right,
had seen it on the enlisted side of like what the job entailed. And I don't know. I wonder if that plays a factor in it. Cause like when I'm going through boot camp, I knew exactly what my job was going to be when I was done for the most part, right? As a combat
yeah.
correspondent. Um, and wonder if that maybe plays a little bit of an impact on it.
Well, in both OCS and TBS, they really do push combat arms.
Hmm.
So you don't really hear much about the other MOSs until you go to an MOS mixer. And even then, depending on who shows up at the TBS, so, um, MOS mixers, one public affairs officer's experience could be much different, from the next one. I remember the first one I went to, the PAO, primarily, like, she told us about singing the national anthem at certain events. And, I'm just like, wow, that doesn't seem that exciting. Then across the room, there's the tanker with the mustache and the swashbuckling hair. And you're like,
I'm gonna do that.
I
What
want
do
to do
they
what that
do?
guy's doing. And I'm having visions of, being on top of a tank, rolling into some city, liberating the people. And that sounds a lot more exciting than singing the national anthem. I'm like, I don't know if I'm cut out for that, so
I didn't sign up for this.
yeah, um, so it depends, right? But I ended up, I mean, I put public affairs at the top of my list, tankers as second, and then common engineers as the third. And because of my background in journalism was how they recommended me to be a PAO.
How was it learning that it wasn't what you thought it was going to be? How was that initially? And how long did it take for you to realize, like, I'm not going to actually do all of the things that I thought I was going to do and that I enjoyed doing?
Once we got the DINFOS, um, this is kind of where we figured it out. And at that point, I mean, it wasn't like the job wasn't going to be exciting. I mean, it was great knowing that we had or we would have stellar Marines that would be doing that work, and that you'd help facilitate that. Um, and then, of course, there's the media piece that goes along with that. And then really what they pushed was, supporting your commanders in terms of their communication efforts and strategies. And so that element we didn't know, but as you know, in those positions, you interact with senior leaders, and which your peers are not. While you're supporting, 2 stars and 3 stars, your peers, like, if they're seeing the captain, it's because they're in trouble.
Yep.
So just it's just different. So I mean, once I got there, I mean, I was surprised that the school was only 7 or 8 weeks. I mean, it was short.
Hmm.
Um, to be like a modified, PAO. But of course, as you know, a lot of that is just OJT once you get to your unit.
And I think that is part of the beauty of the career field. And Dimphos is amazing. I think Dimphos is like top notch across the board. And I know so many people, federal government who still like, they know if somebody went to Dimphos, they can like guarantee that they at least know like these basic stuff and they have this basic ability, right? But that on the job training, I think, and what you're saying, that exposure to
Yep.
other things in the Marine Corps that people are not getting at, especially at the beginning of their careers, because that's the
Right.
thing. I think it's like a water hose career field, whether you're enlisted or officer, of you're running from the start.
I will say this though, at the time, and this was, 99, 2000, you spent a lot of time copy editing and learning about PageMaker, because we're going to go back and make newsletters, which of course I don't think any of us ever did. But um, yeah, heavy on that end, a little light on the media and speech writing and supporting your commanders. But
The Oath We Took podcast, hosted by Marine Corps veteran Tab Bartley, tells the Marine Corps story through the Marines who served. While every story is unique, the common bond is the oath they all took. Tune in Mondays at 5 p.m. Eastern on Wreaths Across America Radio to catch these engaging conversations. Tab is also supporting the Military Women's Memorial through her Wreaths Across America sponsorship page. For every Veterans Wreath you sponsor at wreathsacrossamerica.org/theoathwetook, $5 will go directly to the Military Women's Memorial, the leading memorial and education center honoring the commitment, contributions, and experiences of servicewomen. Once again, to donate, go to wreathsacrossamerica.org/theoathwetook.
And you ended up, how long was your career in the Marine Corps? And you stuck with that career field the whole time, correct?
I did. I
So
did.
how long was that career, and what are, I guess, would be some of like your highlights?
So 24-ish years. Um, yeah, something like that. Because at the end, they sort of add in your reserve time. So
Hmm.
it might be a little more, a little less than that. But yeah, primarily public affairs billets up until towards the end. Um, it it was a great time. My first duty station coming out of Dinfos was Cherry Point, um, at Second Mall, and I was a media officer. Started off as a media officer, ended up becoming a Comrail officer, and this was obviously pre 9/11. This is actually right before Y2K. I don't know if you're around during that time period where people were afraid that planes were going to fall out of the sky, and
Yes.
um, were we all prepared? But I was only there for about a year, because right before, I guess, right around 2000, um, the Muse, which were kind of the crown jewel of the Marine Corps at the time, you would typically do 2 deployments in 3 years with each of those Muse. So pretty high op tempo. And so the captains, which normally would fill those billets, were getting cycled through. So as a second lieutenant, they were looking for people to fill those billets. And so they asked me if I'd be willing to take a MEU, just after 1 year on the job. And I'd heard of MU through Dinfos, but didn't really know a whole lot about it. But I'm like, it's an opportunity to deploy. And so raised my hand and went down to Camp Lejeune. And if you've been to Lejeune, it's a lot different than working with the wing. Significantly different. But at that time, a lot of my peers too at the Muse were second lieutenants, so we were kind of, in it together. But that was actually a pretty good experience. So, like I said, two pumps. The first deployment was kind of your typical med deployment. So, you went and did a lot of bilateral training with different nations that were there. Spain, France, Tunisia, Croatia. We also did one small op in Kosovo that was kind of coming to an end. So some like peace enforcement, peace support operations. And then after that 6-month deployment, came back for um, the workup prior to our second pump, and that's when 9/11 occurred. And so that next rotation was an OEF rotation. So our unit didn't actually go to Afghanistan. I think we did have some of our aviation assets that went out there, but most of our time was spent in Djibouti.
My husband was there for 9 months.
Oh, was he really?
Heard, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So when we got there, I think we were the second MU that was there. So the base really hadn't stood up. There was this thing called the demining facility that was there. And so, but it was one of the places where you could do live fire training. So for the better part of 3 or 4 months, we were there. And then I think shortly thereafter is when they ended up setting up Camp Lemonnier and so got back from that deployment, and just because with the ME we did a lot of training with the Army and some of the other services, the joint bug bit me. So I actually went to Joint Forces Command when it was still in existence, right after that deployment. And at the time, my boss, the new commander, was like, "Why would you want to go there?" I'm like, "Sir, it's joint. I get to work with some of the other services." And so I was still a lieutenant, but I think I was selected for captain at that point, and went up to Norfolk in this joint billet. But around that time was when things started to change, and we were talking about Iraq. And in 2003, as you know, we went into Iraq. And so here I am at this joint command with another Marine captain looking at what was going on in Iraq. And it's like, how is it that we're stuck here at this joint billet? Seeing what the Marines are going through in Iraq. And so we kind of vowed then and there that if we got an opportunity, we'd try and make our way to get in and participate in the fighting. Well, as the Marine Corps would have it, we got a call from headquarters Marine Corps asking for captains to fill IA billets for 2MEF forward going in. And so I looked at my buddy, and being that we're at a joint unit, a joint command, they really couldn't pull us. We had to get approval from our boss. So I looked at my buddy and it's like, "Hey, do you want to do it?" And he's like, "Dude, I'm married. My wife would kill me." And I was like, "Well, I'm single."
No.
so so I ended up, putting my name in the hat, and it got approved. And so I did a 5-month individual augment billet with 2MEF forward, which, I mean, it was late 2004. It was after, the Second Battle of Fallujah. We got there right after the elections of 2005. And it was just an amazing experience there. So I didn't technically work in the PA shop. They had me as a PA planner with the plan shop. And so a lot of my time was spent doing assessments, believe it or not, to try and kind of figure out, what the bad guys were doing and if what we were doing was having an effect. So so yeah, great experience. Oh, and I forgot to mention that when they asked me to go to Iraq, I said, well, if I go, can you guarantee that I get a seat at EWS? And they said yes. And so I knew that by the summer I would have to come back to go to EWS. The one thing from that deployment that stands out, I don't know if you are familiar with Aaron Macon. Does that name sound familiar?
I don't
Corporal
think so.
Macon. So he didn't work for me, but he was in our shop. He was a corporal at the time, and um, towards the beginning of that deployment, um, there were operations out in a place called Al Qaim, and they needed some assistance from common correspondence. So he went out there to help cover the action that was there. And so while he was there, he ended up getting severely wounded during the action. Essentially, I think the Amtrak that he was in hit a stack mine, and he ended up getting severely burned and medevaced out of there. So this was probably around the April timeframe, I think. I'd have to look back and see. So being that I was one of the first folks from that team to go back, to go to school, he was over at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, BAMC. And so I went to go see him. And he was not expecting me to show up. And I've got to tell you, Tab, it was I don't know how to explain it, but he was a very resilient Marine. Um, um, so I'm very happy to see me. I was very happy to see him, and he kind of explained like what happened while he was in Al Qaim, and he was also a very religious Marine too. Um, so after he explained it, and then in this area, you had a lot of the burn victims from all over Iraq and Afghanistan. Um, so he would walk around um, and talk and pray with some of the other Marines and soldiers there, and just had just a great spirit about everything that was going on, and wanted to still go back, believe it or
Mm-hmm.
not, to be with those Marines. And it was just, I was like, this this is why I joined the Marine Corps, to serve with Marines like Aaron Macon, who despite what he went through was still very motivated, still motivating others, and help them get through their trauma. It was just truly amazing to see that. So after that, I went off to EWS, and obviously the war in Iraq was still going on, so I knew I wanted to go back. So I actually recommended to go back to, or request to go back to Second Marine Division after school. And after I got assigned there, I also proposed to my girlfriend. So it's, I don't know if it's a typical Marine thing to do, but you're going to deploy, and so you get married before you
Yeah.
leave.
Yeah.
And so I to this day I still get confused between the day I got married and the day I joined Second Marine Division, because they were one was June 15th and the other was July 15th, 16th. So actually one year I even planned a anniversary trip on the wrong date because I I got it confused with the day that I joined Second Marine Division. And not only that, but um, she was pregnant not too long after that. So, got married, went to Lejeune, the summer of this was 2006. And then I was back in Iraq by December of 2006 for a 13-month deployment. So,
How was that? Especially like new marriage, expecting your first child, and then war.
Yeah. Mixed, mixed. Um, I mean, there's one thing about, deployments, and I'm sure you probably heard this from other Marines too, that um, there's a certain purity to it that you can solely focus on your job, and not have to worry about car payments and house payments and, I hate to say it, sort of family stuff.
It's like the personal world kind of stops.
It
The
does.
everything else around. Yeah.
It does. And my wife Barbara was, I mean, granted, she was pregnant and then later, raising a kid, was really resilient. So um, I felt fairly confident that things were okay back at home. Um, and at least back then too, it's not like you could just call home, right, to check on things. So you had to feel confident that um, things were things were in good hands. Um, but I did like the fact that you could really solely focus on the job at hand. Um, Granted, it was long. 13 months is a long time. But uh, I wouldn't change you know, that experience at all. So, but again, 13 months, this was mainly 2007 and out in Western Al Anbar. So we worked out of Al Assad, Camp Ripper, Second Marines, and just I guess we were kind of on the tail end of a lot of the serious fighting at that point. And so my role was really to support, the regiment with meeting engagements, embeds, um, and I had my team kind of spread out, throughout all of West Al Anbar, supporting different battalions and their rotations. Um, and I think, unfortunately, because of where we were with the war, there wasn't a lot of interest, I think, at what was happening. I remember talking with a Fox News team. We first brought them in, and I had set up for them to go out to cover one of our battalions, and they wanted to cover the MWR areas on the base. And I'm like, I don't understand. I mean, we bring you all the way out here to cover some of the operations, and you'd rather cover some of the MWR related stuff.
And for those who don't know what MWR, what is
Yeah.
MWR?
What is it? Marine Family Welfare. Basically, it's some of the activities to um, take your mind off of sort of the action. So pool halls, video games, TV. It's just to kind of help keep your morale up while you're deployed forward, and actually back to the route as well.
But not the things that are actually why the Marines are there.
Exactly, exactly. So what this producer told me was that whenever anything came on about the fighting in Iraq, viewership plummeted. Like, yeah, the ratings would just go down, and I was surprised, but you know, I don't want to. I mean, my words, America had kind of moved on, but I think at that point, 6, 7 years of fighting, people were losing interest. And even though units were still or teams were still going out to cover these events, they were looking at a different way to tell the story, and it wasn't about the fighting. So that was a little disheartening to hear that. And this was Fox News, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it was just kind of a sign of the times, I guess, in terms of what people were interested in viewing. So did that for 13 months, came back, and as you can imagine, just kind of burnt out. Because at that point, that was my fourth deployment. And so a buddy of mine who was over at MARSOC, who hadn't had any deployments, actually, I think he had one, was raring to go. So I was like, hey, maybe we can switch.
Swap. Do a swap, Steve.
And he was at MARSOC, which had just stood up, and I was pretty sure that that was a non-deploying billet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it would give me time to, spend time with my family and my new daughter. So we were able to work that out, and of course he immediately deployed. And I had the challenge of working with a command that at that point was still fairly new and was still smarting from some of the negative events tied to it in Afghanistan. Um, but I will say that that was still somewhat challenging for me, because and it was a new unit, still, a newlywed husband at that point. So dealing with that and the fact that in the majority of our marriage was with me being gone for that time period. And then I also tried to, I signed up for command and staff non-res, so I was doing that on top of that as well. So it was challenging. And I will share this a little bit about like post deployment.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting. I mean, I think we talk a lot about PTSD, but there's just a challenge of like being away from your family for a long period of time, right? I mean, just being away, and it doesn't necessarily fall under that umbrella, but it's still tough, right? And so it took a while, I think, for my family and I to kind of get back to what would be considered normal. And I think a lot of other Marines, at least with the regiment, kind of went through the same thing. A couple of things that I can kind of laugh about, but back then it just not quite as funny. But post deployment, you go through, and I forget what they call it, but it's just a transition period, right? And so I remember the regimental sergeant major talking to us as soon as we got back and said, hey, none of y'all experienced anything on this deployment that would, qualify as PTSD or qualify as, having some sort of hardship. And we're all kind of looking at each other. And it's like, why would you say something like that? And luckily the colonel got up after and was like, well, I don't necessarily agree with what the sergeant major said. You don't know how, a deployment can impact someone.
Yeah.
And so, and obviously he was right. Not too long after that, the first sergeant, one of our first sergeants came up and he's like, hey, now when you get home, don't immediately start asking for like the checkbook and looking at your kids' grades and, noticing how the things have changed around the house, and, give us some time, and don't just come and like try and be the boss because you haven't been there for 13 months. You need to realize that things have changed. And Tab literally like 4 days later, he comes in front of us. He's like, I had to have a family meeting. He's like, my son was talking back to me. He was very forthcoming about his situation. Like, my son is talking back to me. My wife bought a new car. I didn't know about it. It's just kind of going on and on. But I think him sharing that story with us made us realize that, hey, it's not all butterflies and ice cream when you get back. There are lots of things that you kind of have to deal with. And it's okay.
Yeah. And I think that transparency is such a good thing in leadership that I think sometimes we forget about. Because I think of like some of the best leaders I had, the Master Sergeant Height now, but at my time, Sergeant Height, when I think the epitome of like a, Marine and leadership and taking care of, like that's who I think of. That is like one of the Marines that I instantly think of. And I think that having those hard conversations then makes it easier and can be more of a laughable moment, right? When then you go home and the living room is a different color or like what have you. And it's just like, yep,
Yeah.
what's next instead of, oh, this is
Yeah.
ruining everything.
Yeah.
But you served in a time where not only was the Marine Corps going through all these like transitions with, the American people and what was going on, but also in a career field that was constantly transitioning. How was that and going through that? Because I mean, you saw the career field completely change multiple times.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's yes. It was tough. Um, but I think necessary for the times, right? So like we when I first started in the career field, a lot of our shops were consolidated. So for example, at Camp Lejeune, if you were assigned to the MEF or the MLG or the division, we all worked in the same shop. And so you might be the media officer, but you were assigned to second division. Once the war started, they pushed those folks out to those units, right? And so um, in a lot of cases, you didn't have that relationship with the senior leaders, and so you kind of had to build that. So we basically decentralized the them public affairs shops, and so each of those units had their own team. And then later around 2014, just because of capacity and capability, you know, um, they went through another consolidation period, right, and brought folks um, back to the MEV to a certain degree across the Marine Corps. Later in my career, I went back to MEV as the director. And at that time, we had all of the competent assets, then public affairs assets up there. So we had, leadership had what, 80 some odd Marines that fell under us at the MEF. And so as different units deployed, we would assign the Marines to co-support those units. And
And
it
looking
happened.
back, and I was going to say, looking back, like,
Mhm.
I see how that makes more sense, right? I see how, like, when I was there, I didn't have as much peer-to-peer leadership and on the job training with somebody with you because
Yep.
it was so segregated before that it was like you were stuck. You missed out on a lot of opportunities because it wasn't the PA leadership or that leadership who was making decisions
Right.
for the best of their Marines.
And we set up a team construct. So if you got assigned to Team F, you were, with a team of, you know, 8 to 10 Marines. You had a staff sergeant and a lieutenant that was in charge of that team. You wouldn't necessarily deploy as a team because we would, you'd task organize those teams to go support different things, but you always had that leadership to work with. And it gave the corporals and the sergeants an opportunities to, lead as well. So it actually worked pretty well. Now the unit leadership didn't necessarily like it because they wanted to put their hand on that chief or that officer and say, "You're mine." But it just worked out better to have it set up that way. And we could argue that you never, we always supported each of the missions that you had. You were never gapped, and you always had great folks that supported you. And then we went through this whole, change to Comstrat and the new MOSs and setting up other MIGs. Um, I would just say it created a lot of. It was tough for the outfield, I think. Um, I think more so for the combat camera folks because they essentially kind of lost their leadership and sort of it. I understand why we did it, but I think looking back, there there were better ways to kind of go about it. Um, and I think they're still kind of dealing with that now. Um, so I know I will tell you there were a couple of times throughout my career where I wanted to get out of public affairs.
I mean, that's why we had so many people not retained, right? There were just
Yeah,
moments that it was just like, yep,
yeah.
as
I
awesome as this is, yep.
Yep. I almost went over to become an intel officer, believe it or not. Um, but I'm like, I'll give public affairs a chance and stuck with it.
And you are continuing that now in your career outside of the Marine Corps as well, right? You
I
are,
am.
can you
I
tell me
am.
how that transition out of the Marine Corps was?
So sure. I honestly I didn't want to have anything to do with DOD. Um coming out. I was strictly looking for federal jobs, but not with DOD. So Department of State, Department of Justice, because I wanted to continue to serve.
Mhm.
But I kind of had my fill with DOD. And so I actually started applying for positions, USA jobs, that were not DOD related. Even though, I mean, as you know, there's a waiting period, so you couldn't really apply for them anyway. But I just,
Yeah.
after, 20 some odd years doing that, I wanted to try something a little different. But during that process, the um, the VP for communications in Leatherneck and retail, she had several hats. At MCA, she was going to retire. So she had kind of put the word out, if there were any, Marine combat officers who were retiring, um, if they would, send them her way, that this position was opening. So it just so happened that Miss Langwell, who's their director of communication at CD, had talked to General Tulin, who was the chairman, and she gave him my name. And I'm fairly certain Divine talked to her. Her name was Colonel Mary Reinwald,
Hmm.
retired. I'm fairly certain he gave her my name as well. And so I get this message on LinkedIn from Joe Schroeder. It's like, hey, would you like to come in for coffee? And I'm like, a 3-star doesn't ask
What is going on?
someone for coffee on LinkedIn. So I'm like, absolutely, sir. Sent in my resume, put on my interview suit and showed up. And so obviously I was familiar with MCA, the Marine Corps Association. I had been a member for years, actually since I was lieutenant. Had subscribed to the Gazette, had been to a number of the dinners, so I knew about the organization. And so when they offered me the position, um, granted, it wasn't, federal service job. I mean, it was a nonprofit, so a little different, but ideally very similar to what we do as Comstrat / public affairs professionals. And as you know, it's kind of a soft landing, so you're still kind of part of the tribe, related to the tribe, working with the tribe.
But all the
Um,
like positives.
right, right.
The super positives.
And you can go home at 1700, right?
You're not field daying.
You're not lower right and left right, at 06 every Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. You can actually, take a little bit more time to come into work. So I said yes. And that was June of last year. Um, and I was still on terminal leave, so I didn't actually retire until September. And so far it's been good. And I think it helps too that since I'm relatively recently retired, I still have a lot of the contacts with the folks who are especially like duty,
Hmm.
and being that the the headquarters is on Quantico. I mean, in a lot of ways,
That helps.
but it's like I'm still going to the base. I'm still getting my ID checked. I just don't have a CAT card. It's just this one says retired, but it's been good. And staying connected has been good. And some of the same things that I did, processes, plannings, policy, I've incorporated into the job that I have now, which obviously is kind of how we met, right?
Yes.
Through that. So, so
And
we'll go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and what is like the impact, especially when you see it now on this side, that the Marine Corps Association has to Marines? Like, what is that impact? Because I feel like there's so many Marines who don't realize when it's the Marine Corps Association doing things.
Well, that's the challenge, right? And the way I try to explain it to my boss is we know Tide, we know Gain, we know these different products, but we don't necessarily know that they're being provided by Procter and Gamble, right? So people know the Gazette, people know Leatherneck, even though they're not on the shelves anymore. You've heard of the unit libraries. You may have gone to an event, a professional dinner. Hey, you may have even received one of the awards, at boot camp or an
Yeah.
OCS or a TBS and not realize, even though it says it plain as day from the Marine Corps
On
Association,
it.
that it came from us, right? You may not even know that there's a foundation that provides that, or there are sponsors and donors that provide money to help it run. So for me, that's kind of the challenge. How do you let people know that it's MCA that's behind all of that? Because they know the different parts that we provide. They just may not know who's actually providing it.
Exciting job.
Yeah.
A job that is
Yeah.
not gonna go away by any means.
So yeah, so like I tell them, it's not that we have a problem promoting the pieces and parts. The Gazette has been around for decades, Leatherneck as well. It's who's providing that for you, and what are some of the things that we're doing to help support Marines and the Marine Corps.
Love that. And sadly, like, I don't know where the time went. So I'm going to
Look
have
at
to,
that.
I'm going to have to ask the last question, but would definitely love to have you on again.
Okay.
And maybe we can take a deeper dive of Marine Corps Association and get some other Marines on from there as well. But I am going to ask the last question, which
Okay.
is, if you had to take the oath again, would you?
Absolutely. I would definitely take it again. It's like I said earlier, I've always wanted to serve. The Marine Corps being, in my mind, the best service that's out there. And of course, I had the opportunity to experience two other services prior to. Yeah, I would definitely take it again. One thing I didn't mention earlier, but I think was really important to me too, was that it also the Marine Corps also served as a kind of a rite of passage for me, because I was kind of lost and trying to, figure things out and what I wanted to do in life. And the Marine Corps kind of helped provide that. So yeah, I don't regret the day that I rose my right hand and gave that oath. Actually, I guess it would have been the third time I gave the oath to to serve the nation.
This is the Oath We Took podcast, and you just heard a piece of Michael's story. You now know one more Marine and one more piece of Marine Corps history. His sacrifices matter. His stories matter. Not every Marine's story is the same. We didn't all join the military for the same reason. What is the same is the oath we all took. An oath that easily could have ended in death, and for some, it did. So listeners, instead of asking you to thank a Marine for their service, I am going to challenge you to continue to listen to their stories instead.